Do we have ethical obligations to other species? Humans are part of nature and need resources to survive. But we also have conscious reasoning ability and can control our actions. Our ethics have developed from our intelligence and our ability to make choices. Many people feel that other organisms have intrinsic value and an inherent right to exist. Conservation biology responds to biodiversity loss. It's devoted to understanding the factors that influence the loss, protection, and restoration of biodiversity. And it came about because scientists were alarmed by the degradation that was occurring in our natural systems. Conservation biologists are designed to integrate evolution, extinction with ecology and environmental systems. They tie all those components together and they look to design, test, and implement ways to mitigate human impacts. It is considered a relatively newer field. However, it has been around for many, many years. And it is a potential major if it's something you do get into. A major part of conservation biology is the theory of island biogeography. This is a major tool that conservation biologists will use. The goal is to safeguard habitat for species and conserve communities. And conserving communities requires thinking and working at the landscape level. Okay, so scientists, in order to work at the landscape level, they need to use this theory to help predict what they might see. You recently conducted a lab where you got to view one part of the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. Again, the theory explains how species come to be distributed among oceanic islands. We know that it explains how the number of species on an island results from an equilibrium between immigration and extirpation, which is local extinction. And it predicts that an island's species richness is based on the island's size and distance from the mainland. Now, species richness is what you often think of as the measurement of biodiversity. Okay, species richness is the variety of species or the number of different species present on an island. There's actually many different ways to measure biodiversity, and we'll look at that later this year. In our lab, we viewed that the closer an island is to the mainland, the more immigration there will be, the more species or individuals that will colonize that island. And as you move farther away from the mainland, the number of individuals or colonizers decreases. Okay, so we saw that component. Now, an island size is also very important to species richness. Please note, as we're talking about this, we're not just referring to islands that are surrounded by water. This also applies to habitat islands, which are patches of one habitat type isolated within a sea of others. For example, in New York City, Central Park is considered an island because it is surrounded by concrete. Here in San Diego, Balboa Park would be considered an island, and it's a unique ecosystem surrounded by isolated and surrounded by a sea of others. Okay. When we look at species richness from island size and distance, again, fewer species colonize an island farther from the mainland. So the closer it is to the mainland, the more species we're going to see, the more colonizers we're going to see. Larger islands tend to have higher immigration rates, and they also tend to have lower extinction rates. Okay, so distance is important. The closer you are to the mainland, the more immigration we're going to see. The farther you are, the least. Again, larger islands tend to have higher immigration as well, and that makes sense because there's more room, there's more space, there are more resources. And with that, then you're also going to see less competition and therefore less chances of extinction. If we were to graph like you did in your lab, looking at the size of the island versus the number of species, we would see a positive trend as the size of the island increases. So again, larger islands contain more species than smaller islands and tend to have lower extinction rates, again, because they possess more habitats and have more resources available. Okay, and all of this is from the theory of island biogeography. We can then take that and apply it to habitat islands. So, for example, when a forest is fragmented by roads or logging, and now instead of one large forest, we have these little pieces or islands, we can now use the theory of island biogeography to predict what will happen in these individual patches or these individual islands to the species that live there, and how we could potentially conserve to help them. When it comes to conservation, there are two major methods. One is a single species approach. The other is a broader community approach. Single species approach is where you're looking really at just one species and you're focused on just one species. This might include a captive breeding program, like we see with the California condors, a reintroduction program that we may see with the wolves, Mexican wolves, cloning, or making use of umbrella species or flagship species, meaning that you take one species and you use it and the focus of protecting that to actually then protect others below it. For example, who's going to care about a lowly beetle, but everyone cares about pandas. And if you can get them to then want to protect the pandas, then everything else that lives and flourishes in that habitat will also be protected too. So that's the single species approach. A broader community approach is where you are protecting a large area instead, and everything that's in that area is going to get protected. These include the marine reserves, the marine protected areas that we have off the coast of California and Catalina Island, as well as national parks and preserves. That's going to not just focus on protecting one species in particular, but all the species that live there. Now, there are some controversies, as always, especially with a single species approach, because a lot of times with single species approach, it leads to an area being protected that you cannot develop on. No development is allowed on that land. And a lot of time that land is like a really prized, valued area. And people get very upset that you're protecting it for just one single species. For example, Del Mar. If you guys have ever been to the Del Mar Fairgrounds, the Del Mar Fairgrounds actually wanted to expand their parking lot into the wetlands. And they offered to build and conserve a different area of the wetlands if they'd be allowed to expand their parking lot and destroy part of the wetlands that are next to them. It was denied, their request was denied, because in those wetlands and in that area is a special type of fairy shrimp that only comes out when it rains and only found in that one area, in these areas. And so that single species protection made it impossible for this proposal to get approved. And people were really upset because they felt like economically it would have been better for La Jolla and Del Mar if they could have expanded, yet we're protecting this shrimp that only comes about when it rains. It's not even here most of the year because it's California and it barely rains. What is going on? And so, it becomes sometimes very controversial. And that's something you have to think about when you are a conservation biologist, is you have to take into account everyone's views and come up with the best approach for the situation, and to, again, try and find that middle ground that everyone can be happy with. So what do you think is needed to make these different approaches successful? I know it says discuss with your neighbor. If you have a friend in class you want to call and talk to about this, that's awesome. If you want to chat with me, feel free to schedule an office hours appointment. But because we're not in class, we can't exactly discuss with our neighbors. But I want you to think about what would make a single species approach, any of these, what would make it successful? What would it need to be successful? Same with a broader community approach. What would it need to make it successful and get the support for people to want to back it and follow the laws or rules that get put into place? What would make these successful? Have you thought about it some? Okay. You've read a little bit about the cats in Hawaii and what's going on there. I want you to take a little second to think about which of these approaches are being considered in that article and what's going on there. Just take a second to kind of now think about what we just talked about and relate it to what you read in the article. What was going on with the cats? Why were some how were they trying what were they trying to conserve in Hawaii? What were they trying to focus on, and how were the cats involved? And I don't know if you have a cat at home. How do you personally feel about it? What are your thoughts? Okay. Now that you've kind of thought about that, I have another article that you're going to read. It's linked below. And it's about the complexity that comes with conservation. Okay, the complexity that comes with conservation. So in Galveston, Texas, if you don't know where Galveston is, it's on the southern side of Texas. It's all along the Gulf, and it's actually a small little island. It's got it just to get there. You have to cross this bridge and this small little strip, Galveston Island. And on Galveston Island, there are these piping plovers, and they nest on the island, and they lay their eggs and have their offspring, and they are endangered. Okay, so these are the piping plovers. Unfortunately, also on the island are a large population of feral cats. And we know what cats like to eat. Well, one day, this man, Mr. James Stevenson, an avid birder, was out admiring the piping plovers and the area and saw the cats and took matters into his own hands. So he took matters into his own hands, as you will read in the article, and he killed a cat. Now comes the argument. He admits he killed the cat, but the question is, was the cat feral or not? You are going to be a member of the jury. When I see you in class or on Zoom, you are going to become a member of the jury who've been tasked with deciding on whether to convict or acquit Mr. Stevenson. Okay, you have been tasked with deciding whether to convict or acquit Mr. Stevenson. Now, it needs to be a unanimous consensus, otherwise the trial will end in a mistrial. When I see you, I want you actually be prepared to argue both sides, both for and against Mr. Stevenson. I will assign you one of the sides for us to discuss. Then when it comes time to vote, you will be allowed to vote as your own true self and true feelings. But I want to hear both sides of the case. So I'm going to ask you to debate one of the sides, and you need to make sure you are ready when you come to debate both sides. Okay? If you have questions about what you need to do or what you need to prepare for, please let me know. There's nothing to write up unless you want to take notes to be ready to talk. That's all I ask, is that when I see you, whether it's in class or on Zoom, that you are ready to have this discussion and take into account what you've read in the readings and have a civil conversation with what occurred and if Mr. Stevenson should be guilty or not. Let me know if you have any questions.